Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 ways to fix the card Yogg-Saron. Now, first things first, you might be saying, wait a minute, fix Yogg-Saron? It's one of the best cards in Hearthstone. It's so much fun, it's crazy, makes for great highlights, and it's a powerful card that's played in a ton of competitive decks. And all those things are absolutely correct. I'm also pro Yogg-Saron on average. But there's been some rumblings lately, thanks to some crazy Yogg swings in tournaments, that perhaps Yogg-Saron isn't actually good for the game of Hearthstone, particularly in a competitive setting, because the card really is just absurd. It does crazy things, you make big comebacks, it swings the board in ridiculous ways, and that's not something that's healthy when you're trying to determine which player is absolutely the best at Hearthstone. But it is, of course, a lot of fun to watch. So Yogg-Saron definitely leans more towards being fun than being competitively fair. Now, he's, of course, still competitively viable, just because he's such a strong card to include in so many different decks. But if he's not fair, that can be troublesome for Hearthstone. And since that's been a big talking point in the last week or so, even though Yogg-Saron has been out a while, he's not going away anytime soon. He's going to be in standard format for a long time to come. So I was trying to think of, what are the ways that I would fix Yogg-Saron? But before you talk about fixing a card, you probably need to address the problems specifically. And these are really what make Yogg-Saron so darn troublesome when you're talking about equality or fairness. Now, first off, of course, is the elephant in the room. It's the RNG, the random number generator effect. There are so many different random elements in Yogg-Saron when he's played that it's just sort of ridiculous, right? It's not only what class the spell comes from, how much the mana cost of the spell is, the target of the spell, which spells are picked from the pool in the first place, when you draw Yogg-Saron, how many spells you've played before Yogg-Saron is sometimes RNG based. Basically everything imaginable about this card is RNG based. And when everything is determined randomly, there's so little skill involved. There's no predictability, there's no reliability, you never quite know. Sometimes it's 10 amazing things happen, sometimes it's 10 terrible things, and a card like that is so hard to fit into a game sensibly that the RNG just becomes a monster of sorts, right? And of course, thematically, that's what Yogg-Saron's trying to accomplish. It's chaos, right? Just the embodiment of chaos. But as fun as that is, and as cool as it is to see that on YouTube from time to time, even right here on this channel, it's still not great to be on the receiving end of that if you're in high-ranked games, or definitely in a tournament setting where money is in play. The other problem with Yogg-Saron, or I guess the next problem with Yogg-Saron, is that it creates too much value. There are times when you play Yogg-Saron for 10 mana, and he'll play you 3 Mage Secrets, he'll draw you 3 cards, he'll summon Call the Wild, and basically before the turn is over, you've generated something like 60 mana of value that is still on the board. So it's like a permanent 60 mana value tempo swing just from playing one card. Now, most cards essentially have an upper limit to how much value they can generate. You play Deathwing on a full board, you're never going to kill more than 13 minions, right? 6 of your own and 7 of your opponents. But you're never going to kill more than 7 of your opponent's minions with a single Deathwing. It can create tons of value. It can remove, theoretically, 7 10 mana minions, but there's a limit, right? Yogg just continues to create value, theoretically, on an infinite scale, right? I think he can cast something like 60 spells, technically, but there's really no limits to the amount of value created from Yogg-Saron. And that's a problem, because essentially what that means is not only is it a board swing where you clear your opponent's board, but you generate so much. The pendulum swings too far. So even when you're super far behind, Yogg doesn't just restore you to an even point in the game. The pendulum keeps swinging the other direction, and he just adds 30 extra mana of value from time to time. Up next is one I just hinted at, is that Yogg so consistently clears the board. There are so many board wipes in the game that essentially if you've casted 10 to 15 spells, there's probably like a 70-80% chance that Yogg-Saron is going to deal with your opponent's board in some way or another. Just whether he does multiple area of effects or a twisting nether, there's just a good chance everything is going to die. And that reliability, even though it's still technically not guaranteed, that consistent effect going in, playing this card, knowing that you're very likely to clear the board, it just gives Yogg too many advantages because there's really less risk and downside in playing Yogg. So clearing the board so reliably is another issue. The next one is a pretty interesting one, and that's that there's really no way to play around Yogg-Saron. You don't know when it's coming, first off, right? You might have an idea sometimes, but you never really know when your opponent is playing it or if they're even running it. Even if you did know, what do you do? Do you hold minions back? Like if you know your opponent's running brawls, you don't load up the board because you don't want to brawl to guaranteed destroy your board. So you can kind of have some back and forth there. But, you know, Yogg's not guaranteed to clear the board. Yogg is, they may not play Yogg. They may play Yogg and your minions are all fine. There's just no predictability to it. You don't know. So there's no way to prepare for a Yogg-Saron turn. There are other cards like, say, Lotheb, right? Lotheb is an old Naxxramas card. You could sort of play around Lotheb, even though you can't control the effect. If you think they might Lotheb next turn, cast a spell this turn. You can do things in preparation for that powerful swing turn, swing card that you suspect is coming down very soon. Yogg-Saron doesn't allow that. You just can't deal with it. Who knows what they're going to get? You can say, oh, well, I'll just hit face to try to kill them, but then Yogg-Saron gives them an ice block. You can load up with minions, hoping that something survives, even Death Rattle minions. But then Yogg-Saron casts 2 Twisting Nethers and your board is still gone. Absolutely zero play around or counter potential with Yogg-Saron. And then finally, I think the most interesting problem with Yogg-Saron is that he's so easy to include in every single deck. There's no disincentive to playing Yogg-Saron. You don't even really have to change the foundational structure of your deck. With a card like N'Zoth, clearly you have to build your deck around him. You have to include some Death Rattles. Now that's typically not an issue, but it does force you to think creatively. It signals to your opponent what's about to happen because they see all these Death Rattles. Like it requires conscious effort in the deck building phase. Yogg-Saron, very rarely is that true. Any deck with 6 to 8 to 10 spells can just drop in a Yogg-Saron and suddenly have a very fantastic legendary at the end of their deck. Now, clearly some decks are designed specifically for Yogg-Saron, might run 15 or 20 spells, because Yogg really gets better in that 10 to 15 spell range, I'd say. But you don't have to. Normal decks with just normal board clears and normal area of effect spells and normal removal and normal damage spells can all fit in Yogg-Saron. Only very minion-heavy decks, perhaps like a Zoo Warlock, would have trouble adding a Yogg-Saron to their list. And the fact that he's so easy to include and there's no downside to playing him makes him a card that's just free to toss in. If he had some downsides or some risks associated with him, or if he forced your deck down a very narrow path, you wouldn't see Yogg quite as often, so the RNG wouldn't have such a wide-reaching impact as it does on the ladder right now. So, all those problems said, what are my 5 ways to fix Yogg-Saron? I've essentially put together 5 changes to his effect that I think might make the card much healthier, but without stealing what Blizzard might call the soul or the spirit of the card. Obviously, you could totally just take the battle cry away and make him a 12-12 and Yogg-Saron is fixed. But that's not fun, right? We want it to still feel like Yogg-Saron, but change the effect so that it's still chaotic, it's still fun, it's still random, but has less of an impact via those last 5 problems that I just discussed. So, moving on to fix number 1. All random spells that Yogg casts could cost 5 or less mana. Now, you might recognize that from the card Servant of Yogg-Saron. It casts 1 random 5 or less mana spell. And Yogg-Saron could borrow that from his little brother, right? Essentially, this would reduce the total number of spells available in the Yogg-Saron casting pool pretty substantially. Now, there are still more spells at 5 or less mana than 5 or more mana, so it wouldn't cut out a majority, but it'd cut out a fair number of spells. So you'd reduce the randomness of that, right? There's just less stuff to pull from, so Yogg gets slightly more consistent from time to time. This also has an effect on limiting the value, just because essentially, imagine Yogg casting 10 mana spells. There's 100 mana in value. But if you can only cast 5 mana spells, and you cast 10 5-mana spells, then your upper limit is 50 mana instead of 100 mana additional Yogg benefits, right? So this would just put a cap, basically, or at least a lower cap on all the potential value that Yogg could generate. So those swings, those pendulum swings, wouldn't be quite so deep and quite so swingy. You'd only be able to get so far ahead with Yogg. He'd still probably help you recover from being behind, but he wouldn't just put you in an instant win position as often. And then finally, the big one here with this fix is that this would really limit the number of board clears available to Yogg-Saron. You'd cut out the Twisting Nethers. You'd cut out the Flame Strikes. You'd cut out the Enter the Colosseums. I think that's 6 mana. I'm not totally sure. You would remove most of the heavy-hitting board clear spells. We've all seen countless Twisting Nethers come out of Yogg, seemingly the go-to card for Yogg, and you'd be forcing much lower-cost spells, which typically have a lower impact on the board. Obviously, there are still some area of effect spells that could clear you the board, particularly with multiple instances. You could get 3 straight Consecrations and still clear the board. So it doesn't totally remove that possibility. It just makes it a little less likely that those board clears are so common and so predictable, which makes Yogg a little riskier to play, because you don't want to spend 10 mana if you don't know that he's going to just decimate your opponent's stuff. So 3 things impacted here with fix number 1. So let's move on to fix number 2. And this is a common one I've seen. I think this is probably the lowest impact of all my fixes. And by the way, I don't really propose which of these is right or that they should necessarily even be implemented into the game. I just think these fixes are worth discussing and thinking about card design. And if Blizzard were to somehow change Yogg-Saron or limit his effects, these might be the ways to do it. I'm not making a specific recommendation, and the order here is arbitrary. So anyway, back to number 2. This is one I've seen a lot from the community of people recommending, and that is that the random spells stop whenever Yogg-Saron kills himself. So right now, if your Yogg-Saron kills himself, he just continues casting spells. Once he initiates that phase, it continues to completion regardless of Yogg. Now, an interesting effect that you may or may not have seen is that whenever Yogg-Saron kills a Sylvanas, and she steals that Yogg-Saron, the active Yogg-Saron, the other player essentially takes over the random spell phase. They steal your Yogg-Saron and the active casting element. So we know that Blizzard has the ability to change that phase mid-phase, because Sylvanas will swap it over for you. So why not kind of borrow that logic that when Yogg-Saron, something happens to him, it changes the spell phase. You could borrow that logic and just cancel it as soon as Yogg-Saron dies. Because if he's not alive, how on earth is he casting all these random spells? Now, essentially, this would be another thing that reduces the RNG, because there's a lot of times Yogg kills himself on the first spell and then goes on to cast 9 spells. So you're essentially cutting out a lot of extra randomness at the end anytime Yogg kills himself. You could argue you're introducing a little extra RNG because Yogg randomly kills himself, but still the total pool of random elements would be reduced. Less random stuff would happen. This is another way to help limit the value that's created, because half the time Yogg would cut his own life short and cut the number of spells that he casts down, so the cap, again, is reduced. And of course, it would also help reduce the number of board clears, because if Yogg's not alive, he's not clearing the board. That said, it might not do it significantly so, because most of the time that Yogg dies is from some sort of balanced board clear, like a Brawl or that famous Twisting Nether. So there might still be a fair number of board clears, but it would certainly cut down just a little. I think this one is a little too simple. I don't actually think it's a big enough change to reduce how powerful Yogg-Saron is. It's certainly a small thing that Blizzard could do in the back end, and most people might not even notice or realize that it happened. And that is good for the game, and it's good for the card because you don't have to change the text or hand out disenchant freebies and all that good stuff when a card is changed. So it wouldn't feel like as substantial as a nerf as the other things in this list. That said, I don't know if it's good enough to make the card healthy, but it would certainly be the easiest and perhaps do the trick very subtly. So let's move on to fix number 3. And this one's interesting. I kind of like the idea of this. It would only cast spells from the owner's class. So if you're a mage and you play Yogg-Saron, you only get mage spells. You get Fireball, Flame Strike, whatever, so on and so forth. And if you're a paladin, you get a lot of secrets. Because most of the paladin spells really are secrets, right? At least a fair percentage, pretty large percentage are secrets. So what would this do if Yogg could only cast spells from his owner's class? This would severely reduce the RNG elements, right? You'd take the total spell pool from, I don't know, how many, there's 20 spells per class, 9 classes, right? So 180 spells, and you take it down to maybe 20. So the RNG would be reduced insanely. That said, there'd still be a lot of randomness, so it wouldn't destroy the spirit of the card. You'd get random spells of your own class, so not totally unrandom, just limits the number of possibilities. Makes it slightly more predictable and controllable. This would also limit the potential value created to a degree, depending on the class specifically. Like Hunter might actually increase it because you have a higher likelihood to get Call of the Wild. But many classes wouldn't be able to get Call of the Wild, right? So that's one of the most oppressive Yogg-Saron spells, it seems. So there are some ways to limit the total output of Yogg in this instance. This would also limit the board clear options for a lot of classes. Yes, Warlock would still have Twisting Nether, Mage would still have Flame Strike, but what on earth would Hunter have, right? They could maybe get some explosive shots and stuff, but who knows if that's going to line up well. So a lot of classes would not be able to play Yogg-Saron counting on a full board clear. It just wouldn't work. And then finally, really the piece that connects all of this is that would make Yogg-Saron a lot harder to play for a lot of classes. For instance, Paladin would probably never play Yogg-Saron. Yeah, Lay on Hands could be good, but sometimes card draw's bad with Yogg, and it heals the wrong target. It might heal your opponent, and you just have so many secrets that you'd have to wade through. And a Yogg-Saron that plays 5 secrets and 3 duplicate secrets that gets canceled, and a Lay on Hands on your opponent is probably not the best Yogg-Saron. So I don't think Paladin could run Yogg. I mean, Mage would probably still want to run Yogg. Perhaps Priest might want to run Yogg. There are some classes clearly that have desirable spells that generally have a positive impact. This might actually imbalance some classes. I haven't looked through the whole list. There might be some classes that just have too many good spells and no potentially bad spells, specifically spells that only impact enemies via the wording, like an Entomb, I think, for instance, only affects enemy minions, right? So Priest might be able to abuse this a little bit, so there might be some balance issues with this suggestion, but at a high level, the fact that Yogg is harder to include, that greatly reduces the ease to put him in a deck, and that was one of the problems I mentioned, right? So this would cut back on the number of times you actually saw Yogg-Saron on the ladder, the number of times you saw him in a tournament. It would make him feel like less of an oppressive card in the meta, just because so many classes would have to cut him out. That said, you might just see a shift in the meta where the classes that benefit from Yogg move to the top. So this is a riskier fix, but still a pretty interesting take on how to change Yogg. Moving on to fix number 4. This one I think is really cool. I like this one a lot. And that is that Yogg-Saron would only cast spells that were the same cost as the real spells that were casted previously in the game. In other words, if you start with an Arcane Missiles, Yogg will only cast 1 mana spells on the first Yogg-Saron play. And then if you cast Frostbolt, Yogg will cast 2 mana spells. Arcane Intellect will cast a 3 mana spell. So he would basically mirror whatever order of spells you casted in his own thing. So you essentially would have some control over what Yogg-Saron did when you played him. You'd know that he opens with a 1 mana spell, and then he follows it up with a 4 mana spell, and then you had a 6 mana spell pop in, and then you went back to 2 mana spells. So you could see the Yogg-Saron spells unfolding mirrored to the way you played the game earlier. Now, That's obviously way less chaotic, but it's such a smart, cool way to do it because it gives you influence and control over your own Yogg-Saron. And anytime that a play is smarter and a player has more control over the play, it makes the game better. It makes it a lot easier to control your destiny and actually win through smart Yogg-Saron plays. Still, tempered by RNG, clearly, but you have some influence. You have some say in the matter. And that could make some really neat decks and some very macro decisions early in the game based on your Yogg-Saron. Even within a turn, right? If you're killing two things with a Frostbolt and a Fireball, which do you cast first? Does it matter? Is that going to influence my Yogg-Saron? Maybe it will. And you have to think about that. And it adds another layer of depth and complexity to the game. So your Yogg is almost controllable in a sense, which I absolutely love. This also has a side effect, I think, of limiting the number of board clears, just because people can't run 8 mana spells hoping to hit the Twisting Nether, right? Board clears are in general more expensive, and you can't fit that many expensive spells into your deck. So this would have a nice bonus effect of reducing all the available board clears that Yogg-Saron would cast from his pool of random spells. And then finally, this would make deck building much more challenging. Not necessarily hard or impossible, it's just you'd have to think about it some more. You'd have to construct your deck consciously with considering what Yogg has to offer. In other words, do I include a 7 mana spell hoping to hit that Flame Strike? Do I put in an 8 mana spell hoping to hit that Twisting Nether? Those kinds of questions make Yogg a lot, again, smarter and more rewarding to build around. Because right now you just toss him on the end of the list and he's good to go. This would make it much more interesting to create decks with Yogg-Saron, and that's a good thing, again, for the game. So this one's probably actually my favorite fix of the entire list. Perhaps I should have put it first, but we tucked it back here at the number 4 spot. That said, let's move finally on to the number 5 fix, and I think this is maybe the most common one I've seen people recommend, and that is that Yogg-Saron would simply cast spells for both players. So right now, essentially every spell comes from your perspective. Your player, your hero, is the one casting the spell out onto the board. So anytime you cast Arcane Intellect, it's guaranteed to draw you cards. But this would change it so that anytime Yogg-Saron casted Arcane Intellect, the other player had a chance of drawing the cards instead. So both players could both benefit and be punished from the spells to an equal degree. Now, clearly that actually adds extra RNG to Yogg-Saron, which might seem like a bad thing. But it's really not, because the RNG becomes equal RNG. Right now, the RNG with Yogg-Saron is pretty heavily biased in the owner's favor. The person who plays Yogg is much more likely to see a benefit than the person who got Yogg played against them, specifically in the notion that Yogg is usually played when you're behind, and he's very good at swinging from a behind state to an ahead state. So this would make Yogg still have the potential to swing an unwinnable game into your favor, but it would be much less common to do so. And it would be hard to play Yogg if you're ahead or even, because you never quite know what your opponent is going to get. So you might help them win an otherwise unwinnable game and therefore lose a game that you had locked up. So extra RNG, but equal fair RNG that would add a lot of complexity in how and when you play Yogg-Saron. This would also create a lot of value, so the same amount of value created basically, but it wouldn't swing as hard, right? That pendulum we talked about would swing perhaps just as equally for your opponent. You might swing all the way over here, but they might in return swing all the way back over here, which means you're in the same spot you were, right? So again, the equality aspect of this one doesn't really change the fundamental power of the card. All the raw inputs are still there. It's still doing the same stuff. It's just making it much more level in how it impacts those things. And then finally, this would, as I kind of teased, make Yogg a lot riskier to include in your deck, because you might draw a 10 mana card that you don't want to play because you don't want to give your opponent an out. Yogg is kind of that now if you're ahead, but he's still a card that you usually benefit from so much that the risk is still sort of limited. But with this fix, he would be much riskier to play, and the potential to give your opponent tons of value is there. So you'd be kind of hesitant sometimes to play Yogg or even include him in your list if you think you're a more play ahead as opposed to play behind deck. So that's my 5th fix. I did want to address, before closing, just a couple other ideas that have been bounced around the community. The first and foremost is bans. A lot of people just want Yogg-Saron to be banned. Now, mostly that's at a tournament level where he's not influencing big money payouts like at BlizzCon. If somebody is in just an unbelievably good state, about to win BlizzCon with a huge board and next turn lethal, and Yogg-Saron comes down and destroys that and flips the game the other way and wins the other guy BlizzCon for $100,000 or whatever the prize pool is, basically you'll have stolen something like 50 grand from a guy who played perfectly and did everything he was supposed to do, and just a coin flip, right? Or at least 25 coin flips, more likely. Ruined his BlizzCon and, literally stole 50 grand out of his pocket. And that's not good for Yogg. So a lot of people think just ban the card, just get rid of it. We can still play without it. There are still a lot of good decks without Yogg. And, in a tournament setting, that's pretty viable. I think that's reasonable. It's not something we've seen often in Hearthstone outside of maybe some bugged instances. So it's certainly not the worst idea. I don't want to see it banned from standard format. I think that would be a step too far. So I would prefer, some of the subtle fixes that we've introduced here that keep Yogg-Saron a fun and enjoyable card, but limit his impact just a little. Not to the point that he's unplayable, just tone him down just a hair. So I'm not in favor of bans, certainly on the latter. These other fixes would be much better. Another idea that I've kind of tossed around but didn't finalize a fix for was that Yogg-Saron could mess with your deck. Perhaps he adds in a card, like he shuffles a card into your deck at the start of the game that's like a 0 mana spell that just says, Yogg-Saron has corrupted your mind. So he gives you a dead draw. It's a spell, so you can cast it for 0 mana to feed back into Yogg-Saron. But essentially he just lessens the quality of your deck so that there's some downside, some risk, some annoyance to including Yogg-Saron. So it's not just like, toss the card in, he's a fine fit, he will make my deck better. Suddenly there's a question, there's a complexity, there's a limitation of Yogg-Saron. It's like, he might really mess up my curve if I draw both Yogg-Saron and the 0 mana card on turn 3. It's like suddenly two of my cards are dead. So there's a lot more risk and consideration to make. Plus, it fits the theme or the lore of the card, right? He's an old god. He kind of whispers and corrupts and messes with your mind a little bit. So why not mess with your deck as well? That could be a really simple fix that makes Yogg-Saron just as powerful, but you might not see him quite as often from good players or people who are very confident in the rest of their deck list. And then finally, I really just want to know, what's your fix? You probably have some thoughts. You might have liked my ideas. Maybe you thought my ideas were crazy. But what do you think? First off, does Yogg-Saron need to be changed at all? Is he actually good for Hearthstone? Is he a problem? And secondly, if he is a problem, how would you fix him? Would you ban him? Did you come up with a cool idea that I didn't think of, or some other cool subtle change that might work to fix the card and not destroy the spirit or the soul or the idea of what he does? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that said, leave a comment with your fix for Yogg-Saron. That's going to do it for my take on the 5 ways to fix Yogg-Saron. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.